On June 16th, 2024, the YouTube channel for Battle Cats Taiwan uploaded an event video related to the 9th anniversary of their version of the game, which was called the Nymphis Awards. This event had players vote on their favorite unit from certain categories, such as Best Meat Shield, Best Attacker, and more. The nominees for these categories made a lot of sense from a player's standpoint, demonstrating Ponos' knowledge of the meta of the game. The final category, roughly translated to Dream Cat Award, was a bit different from the others. Instead of having 5 units, it only had 3, and this was the only category with Ubers. The Ubers listed were Kazli the Bane, Balrog Cat, and Child of Destiny Phono. These 3 Ubers were commonly referred to as the Big 3 Ubers of the Battle Cats, Ubers which were widely considered the 3 best Ubers in the game, and considered a level above any other Uber that they could be compared to. What made these 3 Ubers so different from the rest? We've arguably had other trios of Ubers in the past, like Mitama, Gao, and Jizo, so what makes the new Big 3 in particular such a standout group of Ubers? In order to answer that question, let's go look at every member of the Big 3 and how they rose to power, one by one. Let's start with Dazly, who is arguably the first member of the Big 3. In Update 9.5, Ponos added Kazli the Bane to the Epic Fest banner, as the dark counterpart to Kazli the Scourge. The 2 Kazlis were pretty similar, both having guaranteed surge attacks, had more range than Paris Cat, and had great stats overall. If we look at her level 30 stats, there's a lot of things that pop out as remarkable. The first is her damage, which is 17,000 per hit for a DPS of around 3,000. This doesn't seem too great on paper, but when taking account for her level 3 surge ability, the DPS goes up to a massive 12,000 at just level 30. The average generalist backliner at level 30 has around 6 to 7,000 DPS, so Dazly's damage output is very much ahead of the game. But it's important to know that Dazly isn't just a regular backliner, as she has LD on her attack reaching from 275 to 675 range, with her level 3 surge spawning from 400 to 700 range itself. LD Ubers that have additional pierce and range typically have lower damage outputs, like Aphrodite having 3.4k DPS at level 30 due to being an LD unit. Dazly simply doesn't care about this and chooses to have the benefits of extremely high DPS with the range and pierce advantage from LD and Surge. It's almost like Aphrodite's massive damage against aliens, but Dazly does massive damage to everything. Her survivability was incredibly good as well, 78,000 health and 5 knockbacks while standing at 400 range. The high health and knockback count allows Dazly to live for longer than most other Ubers in the game, and as a result her impact on the field is just dramatically higher than almost any other Uber. Her other base stats are pretty decent as well, having a normal Uber cooldown, 10 speed, 4,800 cost, and a fairly quick attack cycle. If we take a closer look at her abilities, we can just see she gets even better. Immunities to Weaken, Wave, Surge, Warp, and Curse. Enemies can't stop her massive DPS with a Weaken, and the Wave, Surge, and Warp immunities are very useful against those respective enemies and allows her to bypass their main threat. Dazly was also one of the only few units in the game at the time to be immune to Surge, which was a pretty big luxury for enemies like Cappy Jr. Her last immunity was Curse Immune, making sure her own crowd control ability couldn't be stopped. What was this ability? Well, Dazly was the first cat in the game to be given the ability Curse, which stopped enemies from doing crowd control abilities as well as Toxic. This ability had a 4.5 second duration, and combined with her Surge reapplying the debuff, if Dazly attacked an enemy, they would basically lose their crowd control ability as long as Dazly kept attacking them. This is an extremely powerful ability, able to ruin lots of annoying crowd control enemies. Henry can't freeze anymore, Mr. Mole can't knock back anymore, and Crockley can't slow. Warp enemies like Mesocosmos Cyclone and Star Pen don't teleport your units away, and toxic enemies like Gobble and Papu end up dealing next to no damage at all. While a powerful ability on its own, It just so happens to be slapped on a unit with crazy DPS, reach, survivability, and immunities. This is the Daughter of Chaos, Kazli. After explaining all of her pros, it's not hard to see why she's one of the strongest Ubers in the game. Upon her initial debut in 9.5, the BCEN community quickly praised her strengths, with the BCEN tier list placing her right in the SS tier, alongside other strong meta units at the time like Jizo, Gao, Mitama, and her similar light counterpart. Many people thought she was near the top, but almost no one thought she was at the very top spot like most people do nowadays. With just a bit of time, however, Dazly would creep up to be the inarguable best Uber in the entire game, being above all of the old big 3 Ubers. The longer the game went on for, the bigger Dazly's power gap was compared to those Ubers, and you'd see some like Jizo or Gao fall off dramatically as the meta changed, while Dazly remained number 1. While Dazly was underrated a bit during her release, it is important to know that the new content generally favored her set of abilities. The growing Uncanny Legends added more and more stages which featured relic enemies, and Dazly could shut down their curse abilities, making them much easier to take down. When the Aku trait came out later, part of their main gimmick was the Death Surge and Surge Spam in general, which Dazly had an immunity to. But another reason why she was underrated was that there's simply more to Dazly than a surface level view of her stats. In a way, as funny as it sounds, Dazly might even be underrated today. Not underrated by how much usage she has, but underrated in the fact that while most people know why Dazly is strong, they don't know the full extent of what makes her so much better than almost everything else in the game. So let's take a deep dive into Dazly and analyze why she's special. Dazly's level 3 Surge is an ability that creates a surge, which is a lasting hitbox that constantly deals damage to enemies every 20 frames. At level 3, this surge lasts a total of 60 frames, or 2 full seconds in a 30 FPS game. If you add the time between when Dazly attacks and when the surge spawns, that's another 15 frames, for a total of 75. In this 2.5 second window, if Dazly lands her attack on an enemy, any enemy that enters her surge range will get hit and damaged. With an attack cycle of 174 frames, this is about a 43% damage window where Dazly is constantly dealing damage. On paper, this might not seem too interesting, but a lot of enemies are greatly affected by this. High-speed enemies like Brawlo or Gabriel can't get past the lasting hitbox, and are caught out with perfect accuracy. Likewise, high knockback enemies like Gory Black or the aforementioned peons can be knocked out and juggled by Dazly's lasting hitbox, making it extremely hard for them to reach the front line and deal damage. This giant death wall that Dazly creates is unlike any other Uber in the game, because no other Uber has as high of a surge level combined with as high of a DPS that Dazly does. This lasting hitbox makes Dazly one of the most consistent damagers in the game, and also has yet another bonus that comes with it. Dazly almost never misses. Most units tend to miss in this game if an enemy is slightly outside their range or is knocked back while their attack goes off. Because Dazly both has piercing range and a lasting hitbox, even enemies that get knocked back while Dazly attacks can still be hit by the surge as long as Dazly manages to hit something. If an Uber like Gao hits a peon instead of the boss, he just hits a peon. But if Dazly hits a peon, the surge she creates is still going to hit the boss and do massive damage. So on top of having broken base stats, Dazly's surge gives her a unique death wall ability, and she is almost incapable of missing enemies. Dazly is also full backswing, or rebound unit like Yukimura. This means she doesn't walk forward until her attack animation is finished, and also means that if her attack is interrupted, she instantly gets it back. This not only causes Dazly to deal even more damage, but it also makes sure that she never walks forwards to her death without an attack to protect herself. Usually full backswing is given to rusher units, but Dazly just so happens to have it, negating another common weakness of backliner units. Dazly's ability to curse is also way better than any other unit's ability to curse in the game, which leads it to being a very underrated part of her kit. When initially compared to Castley the Scourge, most people at the time preferred Castley's knockback ability because it juggled strong enemies and allowed the player to regain valuable spaces. But as time went on, Dazly's Curse may have proven itself to be the stronger ability. Enemy abilities are one of the hardest things in the game to deal with, and by disabling most of them, Dazly has a unique role as a supporter on top of her already top tier damager role. And speaking of roles, Dazly is a surprisingly versatile unit. You can use her as generalist DPS, but you can also use her to snipe enemy backliners like an LD unit. Because of her high health, you can use her on stages with high amounts of chip damage and still get great results. Dazly herself can also occupy a chip damage role. Her surge alone deals 51,000 damage at just level 30, doing big chunks of enemy health no matter what she's targeting, and even if she dies after just a few hits, she would have dealt massive damage already. The 10 speed is enough to keep her safe while also allowing her to pass through LD enemy blind spots to make it to the front line. She can be a support with her curse ability and protect your other units with her surge wall of death. In a way, Dazly is everything, and this perfectly sums up why Dazly was so far ahead of every other Uber in the game at the time. Dazly is uncounterable. There simply aren't any weaknesses to Dazly because she has so many different properties that work in her favor to keep her strong. No matter what enemies or what stage, Dazly is always going to put in work and either help to or just completely destroy a stage. The best Uber in the game before Dazly, Mitama, was already a pretty broken Uber. Her near permanent crowd control was a giant crutch that helped you progress much further in the game by helping your other units. But that's the thing. With Mitama, you at least needed investment and levels in other units to finish the job. But Dazly is a one-woman army. She doesn't need anything besides some meat shields to completely destroy many of the stages in the game. No matter what other units you had or what stage you were playing, there was always a right answer. Just use Dazly. Dazly's power became quite the buzz around the Battle Cats community, not just EN, but in other regions too, like JP, KR, and Taiwan. She became one of, if not the most well-known Uber in the game, and everyone wanted to get her. Around the time Dazly started to become the absolute top meta, the EN community in particular started to popularize an exploit known as tracking, which allowed you to see and manipulate what you got from the gacha. You may be able to attribute the popularity of tracking to the rise of Dazly, because this was the first ever time where a unit was genuinely single-handedly able to carry you throughout most of the game, not even needing most of the common non-Uber units. Even today, tracking is fairly common, and Dazly is usually the gold standard unit that everyone wants to go for. All of her broken attributes, combined with the fact that she didn't need any true form or talents to be good, made her perfect for speedrunning the game. Too many stages of the game couldn't hold Dazly back, and progressing throughout different chapters of the game got way easier. But as we know from the anniversary post we saw earlier, Ponos knows what the meta is, and after witnessing what Dazly did, they may have made some design philosophy changes in order to stop her. More enemies were given Surge Immune, which could vastly lower Dazly's damage output. Zappy, Nala, and many enemies from the Behemoth subtrait were given Surge Immunity, which made Dazly less effective against them. This really wasn't enough to stop Dazly's power, however, as these enemies weren't all that common, and other strong units like Courier could simply take over and destroy them for Dazly. Counter Surge was introduced later in ZL, which had the enemy units spawn their own Surge if they were hit by one. Intended to have all of the players' units wiped if they used Dazly's Surge spam against these enemies, Dazly's Surge immunity made it so that she simply didn't care if the enemies reflected Surges back, and would just keep attacking as long as you protected her with other tanky or Surge immune meat shields. I wouldn't say Dazly had a true counter until Ponos released some extremely overtuned boss enemies, like Saroctes or Banagrios. I think Ponos may have actually given up on trying to make enemies counter her, and instead turned towards trying to make another unit that was better than her in order to keep the power level lower on a relative scale. In a way, Ponos would succeed with this goal and release another Uber that could arguably be as powerful as Dazly, and upon the release of Update 12.0, the second member of the Big Three was added to the game. His name, King of Destiny Phono. King of Destiny Phono, or Phono for short, was an Uberfest exclusive unit which served as a long-range sniper and backliner unit. It has a smaller and weaker first form, like most of the Uberfest units, but the form that was most valuable and the one we'll be looking at is his second form. Standing at an impressive 600 standing range, he can outrange the vast majority of enemies in the game. Phono's attack is composed of 3 hits which cover different ranges, but do overlap slightly. Due to his massive damage ability against traded, his theoretical DPS is about 17,000 to the ones with fruits, and 12.7k to the ones without it. However, the range at which all 3 hits overlap only has a width of 10, meaning it is much more likely for just 2 of the 3 hits to land on a single target. Factoring this in, his DPS should be from 8.5k to 11.3k depending if the respective trait has fruit or not. This is still an incredibly impressive damage output at just level 30, and especially for a unit that has 600 range and the LD ability to extend his hits even farther. Other strong attributes include both wave and surge immunity, a knockback count of 5, and a speed stat of 30. All of his other stats are pretty normal. I think that Phono is best described with one word, and that word is overtuned. Compared to an Uber like Dazzly, who is fundamentally broken in both obvious and hidden ways, I think Phono is simply too strong because his numbers are too high. He simply does too much damage at too high of a range with too long of a reach. For a unit whose sole purpose is to damage, he fulfills his role extremely well, melting all traded enemies on the field without many complications. He could be used in pretty much any stage type, really only fearing enemy super backliners. The curse ability could technically lower his damage output, but his standing range is so high that this hardly ever happens, not to mention the fact that his LD counters enemies like Loris to begin with. Upon his release, players instantly started comparing him with Dazzly, as both of these Ubers were far above anything else in power. Some thought that newcomer Phono was the stronger one, and others thought that Dazzly remained the strongest. But it really didn't matter which was the slightly better one, as it simply became accepted that regardless of the order, these 2 Ubers were the 2 best Ubers in the game. The next closest Uber, whether that was a Mitama or a D'Artagnan, was simply not on the same level as these 2. However, you could say that there was a third Uber that matched the power of Dazzly and Phono, but this Uber was unlike any other top Uber before. In fact, he didn't even come out after Dazzly and Phono, but rather beforehand. The Uber I'm talking about is of course Balrog Cat. Lesser Demon Cat, or Balrog Cat in true form, is an Uber with a lot of history. He's one of the oldest Ubers in the game, coming out with the inception of the Dynamites banner in version 2.0.5. He was a melee attacker with decent bruiser stats, having an exceptional amount of damage output and enough health to tank some hits. Lesser Demon also had weaken immunity, a low cost for an Uber at 3000, and a relatively fast cooldown of 28 seconds. However, Lesser Demon Cat had a low range of 180, and single target, making it difficult for him to land hits on certain enemies or groups of many. This major weakness prevented Lesser Demon Cat from being too useful, and he was typically ranked rather low on tier lists until his true form came out. Update 5.0 saw a true form for him called Balrog Cat, which increased his health by about 34% and his damage by 66%. These stat changes mostly improved Balrog's brawling power, giving him a massive 28k DPS at level 30, almost matching Awakened Bahamut's DPS. It was now easier to get more value at Balrog than before, and you might assume that this true form would have given him at least a decent rating in the meta. After looking through old tier lists, I couldn't find any from 5.0, but the earliest one I did find, being a visualizer of the version 7.2 tier list, places Balrog in the C+ tier. Not very good, considering that this is the second lowest tier in the list. It appeared that during this time, Balrog's big flaws of being clunky and having both single target and low range made it so he was very impractical on the field. Things would start to look better when version 8.1 dropped, giving Balrog his very infamous talents. The most important one was a plus 200% strengthen when at 33% health and lower, increasing both his damage per hit and his DPS to ludicrous numbers. At just level 37, a strengthened Balrog would have over 100,000 DPS without needing a specific trait to target. Individual strengthen hits became giant nukes that did hundreds of thousands of damage and were capable of one-shotting many enemies, as well as melting down bosses and tanky enemies. His other talents included a wave resist, which wasn't the most useful, and a cost down talent, bringing him down to 2,250 cost from 3,000. Balrog also had the standard HP and attack up talents, which were great for a melee attacker like him. With these giant number increases, this surely is where Balrog becomes one of the best Ubers in the game, right? There's no other changes to this unit from then to today, so this strengthened talent must have surely made all the difference. So let's play a game. Where do you think Balrog ended up on the tier list after his strengthen was added? That's right. With all his efforts combined, Balrog was moved to the B tier. Great job, Balrog. Now you might be wondering, if this is the same Balrog we have today, who's in the big 3 Ubers, how was he placed at B tier when his talents came out? And to answer that question, there's a lot of factors to consider. The first and most obvious one is stage meta. Most people nowadays conclude that modern stages, like UL, ZL, and other late game content is the best place for Balrog to shine, and his compatibility with early game content like Stories of Legends was not as good. This is technically true, as Balrog is better in that meta environment, but he still was a beast in Stories of Legend, deleting difficult enemies with a single swipe. A bigger role in Balrog's low position on the list was actually methodology. Way back then, in around version 8.1 and before, most Battlecat's Uber tier lists rank Ubers based on a generalist methodology, or measuring how well their generalist performance was. Now this does seem contradictory at first glance, as Balrog's damage output works versus enemies regardless of trait, but the methodology also assumed that the player had extremely few or just one Uber in deciding their placement. Under these rules, having a unique unit like Balrog would mean depriving yourself of a standard generalist backliner, which was the gold standard back in the day. Units like Amaterasu, Ragnarok, and Shishilan were all placed super high on the tier list for their amazing generalist backliner roles. While this does seem like a weird way to judge Ubers, do note that progression and rewards were much worse back then compared to now, making Ubers and gacha in general harder to get. This is also why you saw a lot of no gacha guides back then. You can see that as the methodology of Battlecat's tier list started straying away from the old generalist methodology, Balrog started to rise up the tier list dramatically. But there was still one more important part of the picture on why Balrog was placed so low back then, and it comes down to the unit meta. Nowadays, we have a lot of better options to support Balrog, such as Rock, Slime, Courier, and more. Some might say we're in a rusher meta right now, which complements Balrog's archetype as he is a melee attacker with a decent amount of speed, able to join the battle with all your other rusher and chip units. But more than just having good units to support him, I think the most important change is that players simply learned more about Balrog. Whether that be how to use Balrog for optimal value, or understand some of his more niche strengths, players learned that Balrog had more in show than they first thought years ago. In a similar way to Dazzly, Balrog had his obvious strengths, the gigantic damage output capable of soloing Eulala, but there were many more aspects that got underlooked which all contribute to making Balrog as good as he is. Let's start off with the general idea. Balrog is a melee unit. This makes him perform exponentially better when boosted, because melee units have their performance increased when both health and damage go up, while most backliners typically only need the damage increase. At level 30, Balrog is already strong, but when you increase his level to 40, 50, and even 60 nowadays, his power compared to Ubers of the same level becomes much stronger than them. His stat talents work the same way, making them much more valuable than buying stat talents on a regular backline Uber. So let's take a look at level 50 talent maxed Balrog, something both attainable today and back in 8.1. 126k HP, 121k damage per hit, and 53k DPS. Balrog has a ton of health and can get in to land hits on the vast majority of enemies in the game. Upon reaching his last knockback, the strength then raises his damage to 360k per hit and an unmatched 160k DPS. Any enemy Balrog is capable of attacking gets torn to shreds, and I don't think that needs much more of an explanation. But perhaps the tricky part is getting Balrog to land all his swings against the target you want in the first place. He is single target after all. Peons in the way can absorb his hits, making his damage output not stable. Well, that would be the case, if not for the fact that your lineup has 9 other slots. Clearing peons is very easy to do by just spamming your usual attackers, whether that be courier, can, pizza, or anything else you brought. Slime waves can clear giant amounts of peons on demand, and even back in the day we had units like Manic Legs who could clear small peons on the field, or a giant amount of Paris spam that would whack away anything smaller. You don't even really have to go out of your way to do this, as you should already have tons of peon clearing from the normal attackers you brought to a stage. The trickier part is actually utilizing his bulk to land hits on strong damaging enemies, such as Arost. Balrog's endurance of about 40k is enough for him to land a swipe on some high DPS enemies without getting knocked back, but if you mess up by allowing him to get stalled by a peon, then he won't be able to land it sometimes. For many enemies in the game though, Balrog's bulk is more than enough to land hits on important targets, assassinating high priority enemies, or just adding massive burst damage to the field. Even if you don't have a level 50 maxed Balrog, your lower level Balrog likely has all the proper bulk he needs for whatever part of the game you're in. Once Balrog lands the hits he needs, the state of the stage is massively changed, as doing hundreds of thousands of damage would pretty clearly do. This is enough to turn losses into wins, and hard fights into easy ones. Balrog's high damage per hit, strengthened or not, also allows him to juggle certain bosses, like Yulala or Cappy Jr. Even on bosses where one strengthened Balrog hit isn't enough, by combining it with your other units, you can reach proper damage thresholds to be able to permanently juggle some of the strongest enemies in the game, like Cappy Kawano and Behemoth Luza. But what I think is the most overlooked aspect of his kit, and also his strongest aspect, is the cooldown. Balrog has an insanely fast cooldown for an Uber, coming in at 28.2 seconds. The average cooldown for an Uber typically tends to be anywhere from 90 to 150 seconds, meaning that Balrog comes back multitudes faster. For a comparison of how fast this really is, imagine you spawn Balrog and Housewife, a super rare, at the same time. Super rares are meant to be stacked in groups, so they obviously have much faster cooldown than Ubers. Normally, you get tons and tons of Housewives on the field before you get your second Uber back. But in this comparison, you'll actually be getting your second Balrog on the field back before your third Housewife, meaning that Balrog as an Uber competes with super rares for cooldown. And this isn't even the slowest super rare. Gacha units like Tathagata Cat and Delinquent Cat have a 39.2 and 34.2 second cooldown respectively. So we have an Uber with some of the best stats in the entire game being deployed at a similar rate to a super rare cat. This fundamentally changes everything when it comes to Balrog. A unit like Dazzly has a cooldown of 124.5 seconds, which is not bad at all for an Uber of her class. But in the Dazzly vs Balrog comparison, you aren't comparing one Dazzly to one Balrog. You're essentially comparing one Dazzly to 4 Balrogs. And well, 4 Balrogs is a lot of Balrogs. Balrog's output is also extremely fast, meaning that you don't have to focus as much on defending the field 24/7 and protecting him from being killed. You simply have to prepare your defenses for the next few seconds that Balrog will be attacking the enemies. It's a lot more flexible, and allows Balrog to work in almost any strategy. Even in a worst case scenario, where Balrog dies without landing any hits at all, you're down just 2,250 cash, less than the price of 2 slapsticks, and your next Balrog is coming back in under half a minute. This makes Balrog unlike any other Uber in the game, because you essentially aren't even really punished for losing the Uber. If you mess up and kill your Dazzly fast, you'll have to wait a while before you get your next one back. But Balrog doesn't care whether he did absolutely nothing or soloed an entire boss. he'll always come back quickly to help you destroy the stage even further. Another thing that makes Balrog a lot better is the Thunderbolt cannon. You may be aware of the Slime plus T-Bolt combination, a deadly combo that guarantees Slime hits a target and lands his powerful shockwave to deal tons of damage on the field. Slime plus T-Bolt is a strong force, capable of greatly swinging the tide of battle on many stages. With Balrog, we can do something similar, where we utilize T-Bolt to allow Balrog to land his strengthen hit on any target we want. Hundreds of thousands of damage on any target you want is insane utility, and the best part about this combo is that the Cat Cannon recharges every 50 seconds, meaning that basically every other Balrog you deploy will be able to do the combo, and have at the very minimum a 360k strike on any enemy you want at level 50. You might have thought Balrog was a situational setup unit, powerful in the right scenarios but a struggle in many others. But in reality, Balrog's stats are so overtuned that simply brain-dead spamming Balrog on every stage in the game is going to generate absurd value. You can try to time and optimize every single Balrog you deploy, which is going to completely destroy the game really fast. But if you don't, and instead just spam him off cooldown, his high damage contributions to the field are still going to be extremely impactful, and more than enough of a power boost for you to beat 99% of the game with ease. For this reason, Balrog might be one of the few units in the game that you can consider almost uncounterable. He simply brings too much value to any stage that isn't filled with medals to where there's no reason not to bring him. It's kind of like if Can-Can, the widely agreed upon best super rare, was on steroids and also an Uber. Balrog's archetype also just makes him compatible with the harder stages in the game, as a stage that is just enemy spam which counters Balrog is usually just completely free stages to begin with, beaten by just spamming your non-Uber area attackers. On stages with some spam and then some dangerous boss threats, which are most of the stages in the game, Balrog can help chunk down the bosses and works very well. And lastly, Balrog's identity is something you can't get anywhere else. When comparing the likes of Dazzly and Phono, a lot of their strengths and main power overlaps. They do a giant amount of LD generalist DPS, and this can be replicated with other Ubers too, like a Ganesha. You won't ever get a one-to-one clone of Dazzly or Phono, but you can replicate their role decently well with a unit like Ganesha. There is nothing in the game even remotely close to Balrog, making him not just one of the best, but also one of the most unique units. No matter what other units you have, Balrog is always a game-changing addition to your arsenal. With everything in mind, it's probably easier now to understand why Balrog is a contender for the best Uber in the game, and stands proudly among powerhouses like Dazzly and Phono. Players back then weren't aware of how good Balrog truly was, and as the game progressed, the community finally understood how good he was. Funnily enough, if we look at tier lists from the JP and KR communities back then, they valued Balrog extremely highly, much higher than EN did. You could almost say we were late to the party in discovering how good Balrog really was. Sometime after the release of Phono is when the big three terms started to get used by players, comparing Dazzly, Phono, and Balrog, and noticing that they were the clear three best Ubers in the game. It was kind of like the old big three, with each of the three powerful units doing different things but all being incredibly strong. The big three wouldn't go too long without competition, however, as in update 12.3, we got a new Uber that can contest a spot as one of the best Ubers in the game. King of Extinction Phono, otherwise known as D4mnation, is the Epic Fest counterpart to the regular Phono, and shares a similar build. He has the same 3-part multi-hit that Phono does, but he stands at a shorter 500 range and has different abilities. Instead of the massive damage ability, D4mnation has a guaranteed chance to slow all enemies for 2 seconds. This is a very powerful ability given his reach and targeting, giving the player more defensive control for a short while after he attacks. But that isn't all, because he also has a guaranteed chance to spawn a mini surge on hit, dealing additional damage. The mini surge also retains his slow ability, which not only extends the duration, but also adds a lasting hitbox that catches enemies and slows them down. When compared to the other big three Ubers, D4mnation can be considered more of a support Uber. His slow can enable a lot of your other units to work well, but even without many other units, D4mn is capable of near solo carrying many stages with basic protection. He also has the same wave and surge immunities that f0mn has, but with an additional curse immunity. This means that while curse can counter f0mn, D4mn is unaffected and can continue to slow enemies even after being cursed. D4mn's uptime is also high enough to where if you manage to get 2 on the field at once, you can basically perma-slow the entire stage, turning into a near guaranteed win. Both of the f0mns had their unique benefits and roles despite being similar to each other on paper. While both were long-range LD sniper units, the regular f0mn was mostly meant to be used for extremely high consistent damage output capable of melting many stages away, while D4mn's damage output was more balanced, although still strong, and his slow allowed your other units to work better. When D4mn originally came out, people thought he was good, but not quite at the same level as the big 3. The lower damage output compared to f0mn did make a pretty big impact, and the slow wasn't as easy to utilize as some overtuned numbers. But fairly quickly, Dark f0mn's power was accepted to where he was usually regarded as the 4th best Uber in the game. Dark f0mn's reputation only got higher as time went on, and he gained notable respect after popular BCJP YouTuber 7 or Shichi used him to replace 3 very powerful Ubers in his one lineup challenge with just a single unit. Mitama, Yukimura, and even Dazly herself were kicked out for just D4mn to join the challenge roster, indicating that D4mn wasn't just a jack of all trades, but near enough a master of all. While the current big 3 of Dazly, f0mn, and Rog were still ahead of the rest of the Ubers, so was Dark f0mn, and many people in the community started adding him to the group and now calling it the Big 4. Any of these 4 Ubers could arguably be the best in the game, and all 4 were much above the next closest Uber in power. But most importantly, with D4mn joining the Big 3 to create the Big 4, this paved the path for future Ubers to try and match the ones at the top. And funnily enough, the next unit to do exactly that wasn't even an Uber at all, but rather a legend rare. Dawnbringer Izanagi was added in Update 13.1, being the first Uberfest exclusive unit to be a legend rare. He was also unique in other ways too, being one of the first units in the game to have the Conjure ability, which summoned an invincible spirit to do a single long-ranged attack with high damage and special crowd control effects. On top of this came an extremely unique attack pattern, having a 3-part multi-hit that covered 3 different attacking areas with single target hits. Combining his insane damage ability against traded, this would end up dealing hundreds of thousands of damage to anything struck by Izanagi, and gave him a ludicrous effective DPS. Immunities to Wave, Freeze, and Curse provided extra utility, and with an incredibly high HP stat, it was hard for enemies to kill Izanagi easily. His Conjure also complemented his build, where summoning it would do high area damage alongside knocking back and slowing all enemies for 4.3 seconds. This allowed Izanagi's Conjure to peel for himself, as well as set up enemies into being hit with his giant damage amounts. Izanagi is a very strong unit that can be used in many ways, whether as a backliner or as bonus damage in chip stages. Although the single target and unique attack style makes him more complex and harder to utilize, if you do manage to learn everything he can do as a unit, you are rewarded with a lot of potential power. In a way, Izanagi is kind of like a combination of all of the big 4. A mid-ranger with extreme damage output like Dazly, a 3-part multi-hit like f0mn, big damage single target hits like Balrog, and the ability to slow and crowd control enemies like Dark f0mn. Due to all of his powerful abilities and uses, Izanagi was quickly recognized as being close to the big 4 in power. The biggest thing that kept him from being mentioned alongside them was probably his status as a legend rare, keeping him off some people's radars not just due to class, but also due to being harder to acquire. Izanagi was a very strong unit, usually at people's number 5 spot for the best Ubers or legend rares when the rarities were merged together. However, as more units get added to the big 3, 4, 5, or whatever the number is, a question starts to arise. Who else is strong enough to be considered to join the big 3+, and if this term should cease to exist at all as we gain more Ubers of similar power? Who's next to join the table? Is it Lastfos, with his extreme damage output and RNG Savage Blow allowing him to skip entire stages from a lucky roll. 7 even added him to the one lineup challenge. There's a lot you can do with Last Boss, but he has a big drawback of not being the most consistent unit. What about Luna? A unit that completely shuts down 4 traits, breaks progression, and allows you to get Bahamut Blast extremely quickly, alongside destroying a ton of problematic stages throughout the game. Luna might be one of or even the best Uber for progression, but her weaker performance in late game and end game may leave her a bit short compared to the Ubers at the top. And what about Ultra Form Cosmo? Arguably the best compatibility against endgame stages in the game, he may be the single best Uber for helping to finish the game up and beat the hardest stages for your first clears. But his more awkward general performance alongside having an incredibly high resource cost and being locked behind level 60 makes him unobtainable in any part of the game except endgame, which could be a big enough flaw to drop his spot with the others. But regardless of whether you believe these 3 Ubers, or any other present or future Ubers are a reason to expand the big whatever, maybe it's just time to stop calling them the big 3. Going back to the past, Mitama, Gao, and Jizo were at the top with their own version of the big 3, and arguably were ahead of any other Ubers at the time. As power creep added more of them to the game, like D'Artagnan, Kazli, and eventually Dazzly, the old big 3 simply wasn't a big 3 anymore. Perhaps we've reached this time period now, and it's time to dissolve the saying. The big 3 Ubers and the battle cats of Dazzly, Phono, and Rog were just an era, and as this game goes on, we'll see power creep and future metas develop. And besides, although Mitama, Gao, and Jizo aren't exactly the top Ubers right now, they are still very strong ones capable of helping the player beat many stages in the game. I think that regardless of who's on top, it's better to use what Ubers you like and just find cool, cute, or funny, because that's what makes the game more fun and personalized. It's always fun to have favorite Ubers, and regardless of how well their performance is in the meta, we can appreciate the designs and mechanics for what they bring to the game rather than what they can beat from it. But anyways, those were the big 3 Ubers, as well as the ones that joined them or came close. If you want my ranking of all of these guys, here's all of them ranked on mechanical design, and then here's all of them ranked by visual design. And if there's just one thing to take away from all of this, it's that Phono is not the best Uber in the game, guys. This furry bait white Grinch lookalike is just not it. Have a good day, and I'll see you all in the next one.